The divining rod has had a long and remarkable history. It would, perhaps, never have been used for finding minerals and water, if it had not been used for other purposes by wise men and magicians from remotest antiquity. It probably became a necessary part of a wizard's equipment because, in ancient times, wisdom was usually associated with age, and it was natural for an old man to carry a staff or walking stick. In course of time, it became a badge of office and developed into the regal scepter and the wands carried by Blackrod in Parliament and by certain officers of the royal household. Its use was adopted by the early church and developed into the pastoral staffs and croziers carried by bishops and abbots. There are many references to use of a rod by Moses and Aaron and other magicians in the Bible, and it is still an indispensable part of a modern conjurer's equipment. During the Dark Ages, all forms of divination were practiced more or less openly, but, with the coming of the Renaissance in the 15th century and the decay of superstition, even divining for water was regarded with the same contempt as necromancy and witchcraft and became the subject of one of Martin Luther's most fiery fulminations. But in Russia and out-of-the-way parts of Central Europe, the divining rod was still used for discovering mines, although it was mostly in the hands of the uneducated classes, and the practitioners were either condemned as being in league with the devil or treated with awe and respect as having supernatural powers. It is generally believed that what can be called modern divining was introduced into England at the instigation of Elizabeth I, who, hearing that minerals were being discovered in Saxony by divination, asked certain merchant venturers to investigate the matter. They found an old man walking about with a forked stick in his hands, shaped like the letter Y with a short tail, and every time the stick pulled down with the short tail pointing towards the earth, the miners dug on that spot and found minerals. So, the merchant venturers brought the old man back to England and took him to the West Country, where he, and his descendants after him, discovered many of the celebrated Cornish tin mines. Ever since, Cornwall has been the home of diviners. Contrary to general belief, divining was used for finding minerals nearly 100 years before anyone thought of using it for finding water. France can claim to have been the first country to make a serious study of divining for water and minerals, when a committee was formed to investigate the phenomenon. It was the same committee which dealt with the problem of map divining at the Second Congress of Experimental Psychology in 1913, and which then became the nucleus of a big international society. In the few months intervening before the outbreak of World War I, it had over 2,000 members. Eminent scientists, including geologists and engineers, then joined the society and began making their own experiments to test the work of the practicing diviners, with the intention of discovering exactly what divining was and how it worked. The government of British Columbia has not been the only one to employ an official diviner. India and Ceylon have also done so, the latter in 1942, following the example of British Columbia and employing a woman, Mrs. H. Mullen of Colombo. When applying for the post, Mrs. Mullen encountered the usual obstruction from skeptical officials. Fortunately, there was so desperate a need for water in the evacuation camps. The government was finally forced to accept her offer with most satisfactory results. So far as I know, Mrs. Mullen and I are the only women who have ever been appointed official diviners to a government. At the 1913 Congress, at least a quarter of the delegates were medical men who had come from all parts of the world to study the emanations of earth forces from water and minerals and how this affected human health when passing under dwellings, as well as the diagnosis of disease by divination. In one small town in the Baltic states, cancer was very prevalent. Children and animals were victims, in addition to elderly people. Even the trees developed cancerous growths. So the government employed a noted scientist, named von Pohl, to investigate the cause. Von Pohl was a keen water diviner and traced a large underground river meandering under the town. He then discovered that nearly every house and garden under which the water flowed had inhabitants, animals and trees afflicted by cancer. The government was so impressed by his report that they removed the entire population and razed the town to the ground. To support all life on this planet, two things are absolutely necessary: air and water. In spite of this, vast supplies of urgently needed water remain untapped in the ground. The huge lake under the Sahara Desert is a case in point. Although they may be quite unaware of the fact, at least one person in 5 has the divining gift to a small degree, and if they have the gift at all, it can be developed. First, cut a forked stick like the letter Y with a short tail, and test it. You will never feel a stranger sensation than if the stick comes to life in your hands and starts to pull towards the earth with irresistible force. It was formerly thought that a divining rod must be freshly cut from a hazel, but any tree will do, and it matters not whether it is old and dry or full of sap. The traditional method of using it was for the diviner to hold it firmly by the 2 branches of the Y and walk up and down and diagonally across the area where water was wanted. When the tail of the Y was dragged towards the earth, the spot was marked for future well sinking. This old-fashioned method had 2 drawbacks. First, it meant walking over every foot of ground, only possible in practice in dealing with a small area. Second, that the marked spot was only approximately correct and insufficiently exact if boring was necessary, for when a diviner approaches a strong underground stream, his rod begins to pull at a considerable distance from the water, and the tail may be pulled down several feet, or even yards, before the actual stream is reached. Result: a dry hole and another landowner who is convinced that all divining is a fraud. Another mistake often made by diviners was to use a large fork of thin and pliable wood, which bent when held by the tips. That gave the rod a point of balance, which might be affected by any chance movement on the part of the diviner. I always used a firm rod with a small tail, about the thickness of my little finger, to avoid being fooled by some meaningless movement from the rod's loss of balance. Although, when learning to divine, it is best to begin with the old-fashioned rod, its use has been abandoned by most experienced diviners, as being insufficiently accurate. A great many now use the motoscope. I always use one myself and owe a debt of gratitude to its inventor, Major Poxin, a diviner employed by the Indian government and who is also well known in divining circles in England. When I use this tool and am working on ground which I have not previously surveyed on a map, I work in the following way. I take the motoscope in my hands and instruct it to take me to the strongest supply of water in the area to be tested. It is held firmly, but not gripped. I then turn slowly round, and it immediately starts a gentle wagging motion. When it comes into contact with the emanations from the best water, it leaps into life and wags evenly from side to side, pointing out the right direction. I then hasten in the direction to which the instrument is pointing and pulling. As it nears its objective, the wagging becomes more violent, so that sometimes I can hardly keep on my feet. Then the motoscope suddenly gives a sharp turn and stops dead. I mark the spot with my heel and a stake is driven into the ground. What causes the motoscope to select the best spot for boring with unfailing accuracy, ignoring other underground waters which may be nearer to the diviner, is to me a complete mystery. It just does. In Rhodesia I was once working with a Swiss diviner, who had made a great name for himself in his native land. We were looking for a large supply of water for irrigation purposes. Each of us used our own method and ended up in the same place. Then came the final work of marking the exact spot as accurately as possible, since it would be necessary to put down a bore. In this we varied by 3 inches. Neither would give way. The country was infested with lions. We had a guard of 3 white men and several native police, trained to work in lion country, and many natives, all of whom were growing increasingly worried over the delay. But, lions or no lions, the 2 diviners would not budge. Finally, the 3 inches were carefully measured and the iron rod, used to mark the exact spot for boring, was driven in the middle. Thus was the honor of both contestants satisfied. But, as far as I know, the bore was never finished, because no driller could be found who would do the work under the close scrutiny of inquisitive lions. Some idea of the accuracy which is necessary and the labor which is involved in marking a boring site by modern divining methods can, perhaps, be gained from plate facing page 96. This was taken in New South Wales. The owner of the property and his son are shown measuring the area, while I am testing the ground between the spots already marked to make sure that nothing has been overlooked. There happen to be no less than 9 streams converging at the spot marked for boring, and the cardioids, somewhat similar to those found in radar, make the photograph of particular interest. Although water divining is less tiring than mineral divining and mineral divining less so than divining for oil, many diviners find ascertaining the depth of water very exhausting, especially those who do not make a point of picking out the best site first. They often find 2 or 3 spots which give good indications for water, all of which have to be worked in detail, and the results compared with each other. To save all this labor, here is a method which I always used myself before I learnt how to mark down the best spot first. To make the explanation easy, we will suppose that the diviner has found 3 good spots on the ground being tested, 1 on the north side, 1 south and 1 cast, which were marked as they were discovered. The north and east spots are the nearest together, so the distance between them is carefully measured and found to be 80 feet. The diviner then takes up his position exactly halfway between the 2 and stands facing northeast, with 1 foot on each side of the 40-foot mark. The motoscope, which he is holding, will then turn sharply and point to whichever of the 2 waters is the stronger. Let us suppose that it is the east. The diviner then turns his back on the north and walks backward facing east to see for how long the motoscope will point to the east before it wavers and turns north. That distance is then measured from the 40-foot peg and found to be 20 feet. He now knows that the east water is 25% stronger than that in the north, which he accordingly rejects and goes through the same procedure between east and south. The better of the 2 latter is then worked on in the ordinary way for depth, yield in gallons and potableness. A rather curious thing which occurs in divining, and which is apt to worry a novice, is that a spot which gives him a powerful reaction one day will give him only a feeble one the next day. This is similar to the fading on the mechanical radio. When it happens to me, I discard my motoscope and turn to the pendulum, because it only occupies one hand. An angle rod will do as well. With my other hand I point to the sun. Immediately, the power seems to be restored and the reaction from the water location becomes as strong as it was on the former occasion. I do not know why this should be so. It is another of nature's mysteries, and one of the many things in divining which I cannot attempt to explain. End of part 26.